She fired him without looking up from her phone, and that was the part he would remember, that she had the power to end a man's livelihood and could not spare him her eyes while she did it. It was a Tuesday morning in October at exactly 7:41 in the underground service garage of the tallest building in Atlanta, and the woman doing the firing was worth $400 million. The man she was firing was a contract mechanic named Elias Brooks, who made $19 an hour and had a 7-year-old daughter waiting for him to come home. What neither of them understood in that moment, what nobody in that cold concrete garage could have understood, was that the worn silver chain around the mechanic's neck would, within 90 days, cost this woman the company her family had built, the freedom she had taken for granted, and the carefully constructed lie she had been protecting for 8 long years. So what was on that necklace? And why would a billionaire's whole life come apart because a man who fixed her cars refused to take it off? The path to that exact garage had begun 8 years earlier, on a cliff above the water, in the dark. But to understand it, you have to start with Elias. He did not know his real name. That was the first thing to understand about him. And the strangest, and the thing that had quietly shaped every day of his life for the better part of a decade. The name Elias Brooks had been given to him by a hospital intake nurse in coastal Georgia, because he had washed up on a beach near Tybee Island with no wallet, no identification, a fractured skull, and 3 broken ribs, and somebody had to write something on the chart. He had been in the water a long time. The doctors could not say how long. When he finally opened his eyes after 4 days in intensive care, he could speak, he could read, he could remember how the world worked, and what words meant, and how to tie his shoes. What he could not remember was himself, not his mother, not his childhood, not a single name or face from before the water. The doctors had a term for it, retrograde autobiographical amnesia. He still had what they called procedural and semantic memory, the how of things and the facts of things, but the thread of his own story had been cut clean. He had spent 8 years trying to find the loose end of that thread. Here is the educational truth woven into this man's wound, and it is real, the kind of thing you could verify yourself. Memory is not stored in one place in the brain like a file in a drawer. Autobiographical memory, the story of your own life, lives largely in a structure called the hippocampus and the regions of the temporal lobe wrapped around it. A hard enough blow to that area, combined with oxygen loss from being submerged in cold water, can erase the personal narrative while leaving the rest of the mind almost untouched. You become a stranger who knows everything except who he is. That was Elias, a whole man with a missing center. The only thing he had carried out of the water was a necklace, a silver chain, thin and a little tarnished now, and on it a single stone, a deep red garnet, oval cut, maybe an inch long, set in silver with a small engraved border of interlocking lines along the edge. The ER nurse had written it into the intake report the night he arrived, before they wheeled him into surgery. And when he woke up 4 days later, it was the first thing his hand went to, and he could not have told you why. He only knew, in a way deeper than knowing, that it was his. Things got stolen in shelters. He had learned over the years to carry only what mattered, to let go of everything that could be taken. But the necklace he never let go of. Not once. Not for 8 years. He had built a small life around that missing center. He had found work where work could be found. Day labor, warehouse shifts, restaurant kitchens, the kind of jobs that did not look too hard at a man with a gap in his background. He had been good with his hands in a way that surprised him. The knowledge sitting there ready even when the memory of learning it was gone. He could take an engine apart and understand it. So he became a mechanic, the honest kind, the kind who told you the truth about what your car needed and what it did not. And 4 years ago, in a community college night class he had taken to chase a certification, he had met a woman named Carol. She painted murals for a living and laughed too loud in quiet rooms and did not flinch when he told her he did not know his own name. She had married him anyway. She had given him a daughter. And then, 2 years ago, a drunk driver on Interstate 85 had taken Carol from him in 9 seconds. And Elias Brooks had learned a second time what it meant to lose the center of yourself. What he had left of her was a little girl named Naya. Nia was 7 years old now, with her mother's loud laugh and a gap where her front tooth used to be, and she was the reason Elias got up at 5 in the morning, the reason he took the early shifts and the cold garages and the bosses who looked through him. She drew him pictures of cars with too many wheels. She fell asleep against his shoulder on the city bus. She did not care that her father did not know his own past, because to her the past began the day she was born, and in that past he had never once not been there. That was the man Vivian Crane fired on a Tuesday morning without looking up from her phone. Now the woman. Vivian Crane was 58 years old, and she ran an empire. Crane Logistics Group moved freight and cargo across the southeastern United States. 4,000 employees, a fleet of trucks and warehouses, and a headquarters tower that put her name in steel over the skyline of downtown Atlanta. She had not built it. Her late husband's family had built it. And when the rightful heir to all of it vanished 8 years ago, Vivian had stepped into the empty chair and never stepped out. She wore charcoal suits and a string of pearls and a watch worth more than Elias made in 2 years. And she moved through the world with the absolute certainty of a person who has decided that her own comfort is the natural order of things. She had a habit, when she was stressed, of taking the wheel herself. On the morning of the firing, her private elevator was being serviced, which meant she had to walk through the lower service garage to reach the executive lot, which was a thing she almost never did, and which put her, for the first time in 8 years, within 10 feet of a contract mechanic on his knees beside a delivery van with a worn silver chain swinging loose from the collar of his coveralls. She would later tell herself she fired him over the parking, that he had left his toolbox in a reserved spot, that it was about standards, about protocol, about the way a company falls apart when the small rules stop being enforced. She would tell herself that for weeks. She would never, not once, not even at the very end, admit the truth. The truth was that she saw the necklace and she stopped breathing. She knew that necklace. She had held it in her own hands. She had watched it being clasped around a young man's neck in the kitchen of a lake house 8 years ago, and she knew, with a certainty that arrived before her conscious mind could catch up, that there was only one of them in the entire world, because she was the one who had made sure of it. So she did the thing that frightened people do when the past walks up to them in a parking garage. She attacked. She told the mechanic his work was sloppy and his contract was terminated and he should clear out his locker by noon, and she said it fast and cold and without ever once raising her eyes to his face. And then she walked to her car and sat in it with both hands on the wheel until they stopped shaking. Elias did not argue. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with people who hold all the power is a way of spending energy you do not have. He cleaned out his locker. He called the temp agency. And he went home to a 1-bedroom apartment where his daughter was waiting. And he made her grilled cheese. And he did not tell her he had lost the job, because she was 7 and the world was still supposed to be safe. What he did not know was that the woman who fired him spent that entire night awake. And here is your first hook, the thing to hold on to. Because over the next 3 days, Vivian Crane was going to make a series of small, careful, panicked decisions, and every single one of them was going to dig her grave a little deeper. She thought she was protecting herself. She was building the case against herself, one move at a time. The first call she made was at 6 the next morning, to a man named Dale Renner. Dale Renner had been the head of corporate security at Crane Logistics for 11 years, and he was the kind of man who did not ask why. Vivian told him she wanted everything there was to know about a contract mechanic named Elias Brooks, where he came from, where he lived, who he was. She told Dale it was a security matter, a possible theft, and Dale, who had learned long ago that the woman who signed his checks did not enjoy follow-up questions, said he would have a file by the end of the day. The file came back, and it was almost empty. And that emptiness was the most alarming thing Vivian had ever read. Elias Brooks had no history before 8 years ago. His social security number had been issued late, the way they are issued to people without documentation. His earliest record was a hospital admission in coastal Georgia. A John Doe, unidentified, found on a beach with a head injury. The name on every document after that traced back to that single night, and before that night there was nothing at all. A man with no past who had appeared out of the ocean, wearing her dead stepson's one-of-a-kind necklace. Vivian sat in her office on the 38th floor and looked at the city and understood, finally and completely, what she was looking at. To understand what she understood, you have to know about Marcus. Marcus Crane had been her husband's son from his first marriage. And when Vivian married into the family, she had inherited a stepson who was already a grown man, 24 years old, fair-haired and slim and easy, in a way that money usually ruins, and somehow had not ruined him. Vivian had not expected to love him. She had loved him anyway, and when her husband died of a heart attack at 51, leaving Marcus as the sole heir to Crane Logistics and Vivian as a wealthy widow, with no real claim to any of it, the two of them had become, against all odds, a family of two. Vivian had given Marcus the necklace on his 27th birthday. A garnet, his birthstone, set in silver, with an engraved border, she had designed herself across the counter from a jeweler on Peachtree Street, because she had wanted something that could not be mistaken for anything else, something singular, the only one in the world. The jeweler had told her the mold was destroyed after the piece was finished, as was standard for a custom commission. There was one. There would only ever be one. Marcus had worn it every day, and then 8 years ago, on a December night, with a storm coming in off the Atlantic, Marcus Crane had driven to the Georgia coast and never come back. His car was found at the base of a cliff near the water, the guardrail broken, the front end crushed. No body was ever recovered. After enough months and enough searching, the courts declared him legally dead, and the company that should have been his passed, through a tangle of trusts and bylaws, into the hands of the only family member positioned to take it, into the hands of Vivian Crane. That was the thing nobody knew, the thing Vivian had spent 8 years making sure nobody knew. She had not simply inherited an empire. She had been the one person who benefited from Marcus disappearing, and on the night he disappeared, she had not been at home. She had been on the coast. The next thing she did, on the third day, was the thing that finished her. She decided she had to see the necklace up close. She had to be certain. And so she did something monumentally foolish for a woman of her intelligence, which is what panic does to intelligent people. She had Dale Renner find out where Elias Brooks lived, and she drove there herself, alone, in a car worth $90,000, and parked it on a street where cars like that did not park. And she went to the door of a one-bedroom apartment and knocked. Elias answered with a dish towel over his shoulder. Behind him, a 7-year-old girl was doing homework at a kitchen table. For a moment, neither adult spoke. Vivian looked at the necklace, which he wore even at home, even now, and Elias looked at the woman who had fired him without looking at him, standing on his doorstep, and he saw something in her face he had not expected. Not anger, fear, the specific, naked fear of a person looking at something they had believed was buried. He did the only thing his nature allowed. He was kind to her. "You want to come in," he said. It was not really a question. "There's coffee." She came in. She sat at the small table across from the girl's homework and the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, and she could not stop looking at the necklace. And finally Elias sat down across from her and asked her plainly why she had come. And Vivian Crane, who had not told the truth to another human being in 8 years, who had built a fortress of lies 40 floors high, looked at this gentle man in his small kitchen and felt the fortress crack. She did not confess. She was not capable of that then or ever. But she asked him a question. "Where did you get the necklace?" "I had it when I woke up," he said. 8 years ago, in a hospital. I don't remember anything before that." He paused, and his hand went to the stone the way it always did. "I don't know where it came from. I only know it's mine." "It isn't yours," she said, and her voice came out, lower and older than she meant it to. It belonged to my son. The word son hung in the air. The little girl had stopped doing her homework and was watching the grown-ups the way children do when they sense the temperature of a room change. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing that, although neither of them knew it yet, was the beginning of the end of everything Vivian had built. He said, "Then maybe you can tell me who I am." Vivian Crane left the apartment without answering. But she had made one final mistake, the worst one, because by going there in person, by being seen at that door by a downstairs neighbor who happened to be a retired Atlanta police detective named Walter Briggs, she had connected herself, in the memory of a trained and curious man, to a homeless mechanic wearing a dead heir's necklace. And Walter Briggs, who had spent 30 years noticing things that did not add up, noticed. What Vivian did next was hire a lawyer to make Elias disappear, quietly, with money. And that decision is where she lost the war, because the lawyer she called, a careful woman named Renata Hollis, listened to what her client wanted, and listened to the gaps in the story, and did something Vivian had not paid her to do. She started asking questions. Renata Hollis was the kind of attorney who had spent a career learning that the client who wants something buried usually buried it themselves. She agreed to make contact with Elias Brooks, but before she did, she pulled the public record on the Marcus Crane disappearance, and she pulled the coroner's filings, and she found the same thing Vivian had found. A John Doe washed up on a beach 40 miles down the coast from where Marcus Crane's car went off the cliff, admitted within 48 hours of the night Marcus vanished. A man who had been in the water, a man wearing a one-of-a-kind necklace, and a detail that had never made it into any newspaper. The original missing persons inquiry into Marcus Crane had been closed unusually fast. The recommendation to close it had come from a single phone call to the Coastal Sheriff's Office. The call had come from the corporate offices of Crane Logistics. The caller had been Vivian Crane. Renata Hollis sat with that for a long time. Then she met Elias in person, in a diner, with his daughter coloring in the next booth, and instead of offering him money to disappear, she told him the truth as far as she knew it, and she asked him a question no one had asked him in 8 years. "Do you want to find out who you are?" Elias looked over at his daughter, who was filling in the sky of her drawing with the wrong color blue, the way she always did, and he thought about the necklace, and he thought about the woman in his kitchen who had said the word son, like it cost her blood, and he said yes. What followed took 6 weeks and the kind of patient, unglamorous work that real justice is actually made of. A DNA test came first, run against a sample of Marcus Crane's preserved medical records, which the family had kept in trust. The result was precise, and it answered one question and opened another. Elias Brooks was not Marcus Crane. The two men were not the same person. But they were not strangers either. The genealogical cross-reference came back with a relationship the lab flagged twice to be sure. Half-brothers, same father. Elias Brooks was the son of the man who had founded the empire Vivian Crane now ran. He was the unacknowledged child of an affair her late husband had carried, on decades earlier with a woman named Daniela Reyes, a building services worker in the old Crane headquarters, a woman who had given birth to a son and listed the father as unknown to protect a married man's name, and who had died in a car accident on the interstate when that son was barely 3 years old. The boy had been placed in foster care. The placement records had been altered more than once until they pointed nowhere at all. He had grown up in the cold edges of other people's families, and as a grown man, somehow, someway, he had come back into the orbit of the family that had erased him. And on a cliff above the water 8 years ago, something had happened between two brothers that only one of them had survived. The fragments came back to Elias slowly, the way the neurologist had promised they would. Memory returns emotion first and fact last, feeling before image, the sense of a person before their face. He remembered cold. He remembered the sound of water hitting rock in a particular rhythm. He remembered a fair-haired man, slim, with kind eyes and Vivian's stepson's face, gripping his shoulders in the dark and saying, "I found you. I finally found you, and then headlights, and then a third car that should not have been there. And he remembered hands in the water, lifting a chain over his head and pressing it down hard, as if to say, "Take this, so they will know you, so you will not be a stranger anymore." Marcus Crane had found his lost half-brother. Marcus had been bringing him home, and someone had run them both off the road to make sure that home never happened, because a living, breathing, blood heir to the Crane fortune would have undone everything that Vivian Crane stood to gain from Marcus being gone. Walter Briggs, the retired detective downstairs, gave a sworn statement about the night he saw a billionaire knock on a poor man's door. The coastal sheriff's office reopened the file. A forensic accountant traced the trusts and the transfers, and the convenient way an entire fortune had flowed into the hands of a woman with no blood claim to a single dollar of it. And Renata Hollis, who had been hired to bury a man, instead built the case that dug up the truth. The reckoning came in a boardroom on the 38th floor, on a gray Thursday in December, almost exactly 8 years to the day after Marcus Crane drove to the coast. Vivian had called the meeting herself to push through a final set of governance changes that would have locked her control of the company in place permanently. She had the votes. She had spent weeks getting the votes. The doors opened at 9, and the board filed in, and Vivian reviewed her notes with the calm of a woman executing a plan she had rehearsed for years. Then Renata Hollis walked in, and behind her, Walter Briggs. And behind him, 2 investigators from the reopened coastal case, and behind them, in a clean shirt that fit him correctly, his beard gone, his face fully visible, for the first time in 8 years, walked Elias Brooks, and around his neck was a worn silver chain with a single red stone. Vivian Crane looked at his face, and she saw her late husband's jaw, and the bottom dropped out of the world. The evidence was presented over 3 hours, the way real evidence is presented. Not with drama, but with weight, each piece load-bearing, until the whole structure was undeniable. The DNA, the altered foster records, the phone call that closed a missing persons case in a single morning, the financial trail, the witness from the coast who remembered a well-dressed woman asking strange questions at a beach 40 miles from where a car went off a cliff. And Vivian, to the very end, never broke. She did not weep. She did not confess. When the board voted 11-2 to suspend her authority pending the criminal investigation now formally underway, she sat very straight in her chair and said, in a voice like cold iron, that she had protected this company, that everything she had done had been to protect this company and the 4,000 people who depended on it, and that history would understand even if this room did not. She believed it. That was the most chilling thing about her. She had told herself the lie so many times that it had become the load-bearing wall of her entire self, and to admit fault now would have brought the whole building down. So she chose, instead, to stand in the rubble and insist it was a fortress. Elias did not gloat. He sat quietly through all of it, and when it was over, he stood, and Vivian, gathering her coat, paused beside him, because she could not help herself, because some part of her needed the last word. "You were never one of us," she said, and Elias looked at her, this man who had been erased and drowned and forgotten and fired, who had carried the one thing that was his through 8 years of having nothing. And he said the only thing worth saying. "I know exactly who I am now," he said. "Can you say the same?" She had no answer for that. She never would. The legal architecture took months to untangle. There were trusts and bylaws and a criminal trial that would run for the better part of a year. But the essential thing settled quickly, because the truth, once it surfaces, is heavy and stays down. Elias Brooks, who had been a John Doe and a day laborer, and a contract mechanic fired without a glance, was confirmed as a blood heir to the Crane fortune, the unacknowledged son finally acknowledged, the stranger finally named. He did not move into a tower. He bought a small house with a yard because Nia had always wanted a yard. He kept working with his hands because his hands were the one part of him that had never forgotten anything. And he set up a foundation, quietly, in the name of his late wife and his lost mother both, to help people who had fallen through the cracks the way he had, the men and women a city moves around without ever stopping for. And here, in the last stretch, is the small grace the story had been saving. Renata Hollis, the lawyer who had been hired to make him vanish, and had instead given him back his name, kept finding reasons to stop by, to go over paperwork, to check on the foundation, to stay for dinner, then for a second dinner, then for a Sunday that had nothing to do with paperwork at all. She was a serious woman who did not give her warmth away cheaply, and she had watched this man stay gentle through the kind of injustice that turns most people to stone. And she had decided that gentleness, in the end, was the rarest thing she had ever seen. There is a photograph from a year later, taken at the Foundation's first anniversary, that ran in an Atlanta paper. It shows Elias Brooks laughing, his daughter on his shoulders, Renata's hand on his arm, the silver necklace just visible at his collar. And in the corner of that same paper, on a different page, was a smaller story about the sentencing of a former logistics executive. A woman photographed leaving a courthouse alone. No pearls, no tower, no one beside her, looking at a life that had loved a man she had thrown away, and a family she had tried to erase. All of it flourishing now in full view, while she had nothing left at all. She had insisted, to the last, that she had done the right thing. She was the only one who still believed it. Elias went back, once, to the beach near Tybee Island, where a man with a dog had found him 8 years before. He stood at the waterline in a coat that fit him, his daughter hunting for shells a few yards down the sand, and he held the necklace in his hand, the stone warm from his skin, and he thought about his brother, who had found him and lost his life doing it, who had pressed this chain into his hands in the cold water, so that one day, somehow, someone would look up and finally know his name. It had taken 8 years, but the water had given him back. And the truth, no matter how deep you sink it, no matter how powerful the hands that hold it down, does not stay buried forever. It floats. It always eventually floats. He turned up the collar of his coat against the wind, called his daughter, and walked back into a life that was finally, completely, undeniably his own. If this story held you from the first line to the last, hit that like button right now. It costs you 1 second, and it helps this reach someone today who needs the reminder that the truth does not stay buried forever, no matter how powerful the hands that hold it down. Subscribe if you are new here. Every week we bring you stories like this one, about dignity, about justice, about the people the world tried to erase, and the ones who refused to stay erased. Drop a comment below. Have you ever held on to one small object that turned out to mean everything? I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that no matter how long you have been invisible, the right person will eventually look up and see you. See you next time. This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, and events are products of the imagination, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual companies, is entirely coincidental. It is a dramatized story created for reflection and entertainment. I keep coming back to one quiet idea in this story. Elias never demanded anything. He never begged, never raised his voice, never tried to convince anyone he mattered. He just stayed kind in a life that gave him every reason not to be. And in the end, the thing that saved him was not power or money or revenge. It was that he refused to let go of the one true thing he had, and he stayed decent long enough for someone to finally notice. Maybe that is the real lesson. The people we overlook are carrying whole worlds we never bother to see, and the smallest act of looking, of actually looking at the person in front of us, might be the most powerful thing any of us ever does.